Hello and welcome to this Deakin University alumni webinar presented by Deakin alumnus Richy Bennett. Sam Johnston here from the Deakin Alumni Relations team. It's great to have you with us. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which we're broadcasting today, the Wadwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and to pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. To watch past webinar and seminar recordings, visit the webinar and resources page on the Deakin alumni website. For those who've just joined the session, welcome to the Deakin Alumni webinar with presenter Richy Bennett, titled From Big Wave Riders to AFL Umpires, 20 Years of High Performance Psychology. After beginning his career in community and Indigenous mental health, Deakin alumnus Richy Bennett combined his passions for surfing and psychology to become the first psychologist to consult globally on the World Surf League. From pioneering the field of surf psychology and authoring his first book, The Surfer's Mind, Richy continued to ride his waves of passion with several senior performance psychology roles in Australian Olympic, Paralympic and Commonwealth Games teams. Richy is currently the AFL umpires performance psychologist, and from his private practice in Janjak, he consults locally and globally with entry-level to elite performers in sport, extreme, adventure and artistic pursuits, military, emergency, healthcare, education and corporate settings. Thank you so much for joining us today, Richy. Over to you.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks, Deakin alumni, for creating the space to share with everyone today, and welcome. Thanks for tuning in. I'm just going to share a little about myself and my evolution, I guess, in psychology, particularly in performance psychology. And, something that I understand about all performers is that we're a human first who happens to perform. So I'm going to share a little bit about myself as well. And, who you are as a person always comes through as what you do and deliver as a professional, whether that's in elite sport or in your career or other settings. So sometimes it's helpful to gain some insights about self and how that actually unfolds in your professional life and your performance life. So I guess we'll start from the start too. A little bit of background on psychology and the origins of psychology. I feel it's always important to understand our lineage. And, the lineage from a language perspective, the word psyche actually means breath or the principle of life, the spirit or the soul. And logia, that means speech or word or reason actually, and study of. So psychology for me and in its origin is very much about the study of life, the study of self, and along with the mind encompasses the whole being, the soul, the spirit, and the body as well, really. The body has its own language and intelligence. And as we have here, a beautiful picture of a portal. The mind for me is really like a portal to our world, the world around and the world within. And it can be our jail of joy. So sometimes that portal can feel like it's got some bars across it, when we're attached to beliefs or other things that are holding us back. But other times, like this beautiful photo, it's the dawn of a new day and we welcome that with joy. Our natural state's freedom, of course, too. So it's ideal that our portal, our mind, is one that's free, and that's such a central element of both high performance as well as personal enrichment throughout our lives, as well as the enrichments and joy we share with others. A lot of the enrichment and joy that we share is through our passions, and for me, I've always been a water person, definitely a water baby there. Very fortunate to have a loving auntie who built a beach house on the Mornington Peninsula, and so our family spent a lot of time in the ocean on the bay side, and then when we got a little bit more proficient with our swimming and our water knowledge on the coast side, Gunnamatta and Portsea and all the beaches around there and in between. And so surfing really became a passion for me in the very early days, even just floating around in the waves and feeling my body being lifted and moved and thrashed around by the waves, just body surfing or on surf mats or boogie boards and things like that was just so much fun and such a thrill to share with my brother and sister and family. And so it really opened up this connection that I still have that's very deep and intimate with the ocean and with the feeling of being held by the ocean, as well as being thrust along by some pretty magic waves, which is always fun. Another really important part of our passions that I find is that we all seem to have our own Everest. And for me, as a surfer, my Mount Everest was, the real love and desire to surf Waimea Bay. Waimea Bay is considered the spiritual home of big wave riding. It's on the north shore of Oahu in Hawaii. And when I was a little kid, my bedroom walls were just covered in posters of big waves. And I always in awe and wonder of how those surfers could take on these life-threatening situations, particularly after I'd had a pretty heavy tumble down at Gunnedah on a relatively small day. Another important element of our evolution as a person as well as a performer is, welcoming and seeking divine guidance in our life. And for me, that's come from birth through to now, a lot through nature. And I've been very fortunate to have some beautiful dogs, beautiful Labradors in my life. When I was born, we had a golden lab. He was about 5 when I was born. And the depth of love and connection that I experienced in that relationship was just profound. And it's one of those experiences that touches you for your whole life. And it's also one of those experiences that when it ends can be, it's your first great pain, really. And for me, that was my first great pain, my whole being, my whole psyche, if you like, when he passed on. And, through that passing, of course, you start to understand the realities of life and death, of growth and decay, of some of the actual movements and experiences that we have in life. But it's very important. It's kind of not what happens to the human, it's more how we're supported through it. And I gained a lot of support from my second little lab there. He came along when I was 10 and was with me until I was 24. So from about grade 5 at school right through to he was with me when I started my first days as a psychologist. So my whole entire life. So you can imagine how much space he held for someone who's pre-teen, pre-puberty, right through to growing into an adult. And to, he really was that being in my life that held space, that listened with love and reflected in behaviour. So sometimes just the listening and holding space is really the liberation. And then it was quite an interesting experience when, of course, he passed on when I was about 24, that there was a real freedom to that as well. And at the time, my career was really just starting, and it was shortly after that I did 12 years of global travel, so which wouldn't have been possible with a little guy like that in my life. And then today, about 12 months ago, I brought a new little being into my life, or what I, how I like to say it is, I was very grateful to be accepted as the student of Mana. Mana's my black lab at the moment, and it's quite interesting to not have a puppy or a dog for 20 years. And then when you consider having one, bringing one into your world, I was really intentional about, what's the nature of the relationship I'd like to have with this puppy? What's the process and approach that I'm going to take to his training and, welcoming him to my world, but also, guiding him on how he and I can be in harmony. And for me, this is where values can be really powerful, both in our personal movements and our performance. And for me, I just kept it pretty simple. The mind works best when we keep things simple. And kindness really is the value that resonated for me. So throughout his whole life with me so far, it's always very gentle, all different behaviours that he has I approach with curiosity and kindness. So yes, of course he chews a lot, but isn't that natural for a puppy? And it's just that positive reinforcement and redirection and guidance towards what's good to chew and what might not be. And I think he knows I love surfing because he's never chewed a wetsuit or a booty, which is pretty amazing. What he does like to chew is sticks and bones, and he knows that because he's very much an indoor-outdoor dog, he knows that sticks and bones are outside. And so when he's got a stick, it's out. When he's got a bone, it's out. And this is his little solution that he's come up with. And here's Mana, a couple of pics of Mana chewing his stick with his entire body inside the home, but the stick just outside the door, chewing his bone with his entire body inside the home, but his bone just outside. And for me, it's a really good example of how when you create a space of freedom and kindness for others, you really open the space for that birth of creativity. And he's been incredibly creative with that rule in our home. And, for me, in terms of a defining quality of the world's greatest performers in all domains, sport, arts, business, they're the people that are being creative. They're creating something from nothing, or they're listening and learning to what the realities are and coming up with a new way to actually perform at their full potential, at their highest peak in that reality. So obviously Mother Nature's been a huge part of my love and connection and evolution as a person, and guidance in terms of my inner world, as well as what I love to do with the world around. But also human nature, I find, this might have been the beginnings of my interest and passion in psychology. We've all been touched by music, and there's actually lots of studies out there that shows how deeply music touches the whole psyche, our whole being. And for me, when I was very young, a couple of artists, Jimi Hendrix and Pink Floyd, really had a major impact, and still do. I still play them over and over. They're just wonderful. You know, Jimmy was such a wild, creative being, such an imaginative being, and I'll never forget seeing the first time I saw him play. It was just on the telly. But I'd switched on the telly one morning, and here's this guy just playing guitar with his teeth, playing it behind his head. Then he put it on the ground and lit the thing on fire, and it was still making these amazing sounds, you know. But the other thing that was really beautiful about Jimi Hendrix, and what I really appreciate about him as a musician and, as a human, is he was a wonderful poet. And he could really capture some of the essences, and he really did capture some of the essences of life through his poetry or his lyrics in his songs. One that really comes to mind is it's called Castles Made of Sand, and there's a line in there that goes, "And so castles made of sand melt into the sea eventually." Apologise for my singing quality there, but it's such a beautiful way to capture the universal law of impermanence. And it's such a divine teaching, because whatever will arise will fall away. And again, it's very important in high performance, because errors will arise, but they will fall away. It's more about how you, manage that moment, or choose to manage that moment. And Pink Floyd, the Wall, it's just such a wonderful album and wonderful story about the human condition. And when we have adversity, we've got some options here. And of course, in The Wall, the whole reason I think it's called The Wall is part of the lyric that comes out of the song Mother, where it's, "Mother, should I build the wall?" This young kid's had some really heavy life adversities, lost his dad to the war, hasn't got along with his mum's many partners, and thrust into a pretty high temptation, high seduction world as a musician, and taken the path of drugs and other things. So, he's built a psychological defence around himself, and it really resonated for me, just because you could see how there was this momentary relief, but then there was this dramatic ongoing of adversities in the person's life, because they built the wall, and of course when they smashed the wall down, they were able to find their freedom again. Along with Mother Nature and human nature, of course, education through our formal systems has also been a wonderful enrichment through my career as a psychologist. And I was very fortunate to be offered a place at Deakin Warm Ponds in the 90s there, when it was still a few prefab boxes around the main structure. And I enrolled in an arts degree. Back then, as now, it's still 6 years of training to become a registered psychologist. However, in the 90s, I think up until about 2013, you could do a process they called the 4+2, which was you could do 4 years of university. So you do your undergrad with a major in psychology, honours degree, fourth year in psychology, and then you could either do a 2-year master's, that's your 6 years, or you could go and do 2 years full-time practice under supervision, do 100 hours, so an hour a week with a supervisor across 2 years. And I chose the 4+2. I did do a sports psychology topic in my honours thesis. I looked at the mental strategies that endurance athletes use to cope with pain while they're racing, particularly triathletes, and really loved that. And so I did have a sense that I'd like to go into sport and performance psychology. But as you can imagine, and the situation might even be similar now, where certainly in the late 90s, with just an honours degree and no full registration and no experience, it's not likely that you're going to get a job anywhere in sport and performance psychology. So I looked around to see what was out there, and was incredibly fortunate to discover Warrnambool Base Hospital, which is now Southwest Healthcare, and the whole system that they have for delivering mental health care to the community in the whole Southwest region. So I worked at Julia Place, which was Portland Community Psychiatric Service, and I had 3 wonderful years at Portland. The +2, my supervisor was Dr. Carol Holbert, just a wonderful human, and an incredibly just an amazing psychologist. She had a speciality, of course, in clinical psychology and particularly in personality disorders and borderline personality disorder. And she just had a really beautiful way in our sessions of listening and reflecting back the insights that I guess at the time my child's mind as a professional in psychology was coming up with my observations. And it was very much a deep end experience. So my very first call out on my first day was a failed suicide attempt, and going to Portland Base Hospital and seeing a young man there with charcoal dripping out of his mouth. He just had his stomach pumped. He tried to overdose. His fiancée was in the corner and in tears, of course. And it was a very extreme human experience. It's the first time in my life that I'd observed anything like that. I've been very fortunate that mental health, suicide, these experiences haven't really been something that's hit my family. So it was really quite an extreme experience. I was there with a colleague. That was another amazing experience at Portland. The community psychiatric nurses, there was 4 there, and they were all 10 plus years experience in community settings plus inpatient settings, and their experience and wisdom was such a great support for me and helped guide my skills. So Andrew Robinson was the psych nurse that day that I was with, and he took the lead on the situation, and it was just so impressive how he could really have empathy and compassion with this young man and his fiancée, and at the same time, be clear about the realities of what's happened, and make the assessment that it was, perhaps a silly decision rather than impacted by failed insight, and potential for misadventure, and these other lessons that all came out. And I think when you're thrown into the deep end, these things really resonate for you throughout your career, and that experience that first day resonated, and my confidence was really sound to deal with those critical incidences from that day forward, a lot due to Andrew Robinson's response on the day. And then my first client, well, he was a surfer, so it was pretty obvious the reason that the guys in our team decided to allocate me as his case manager. My first long-term client, he had a very chronic experience of schizophrenia as well as being treatment resistant to the medication. So he was having a lot of challenges for about 5 or 6 years before I came along. And by the time I came along, he was spending 23.5 hours a day in his bedroom, entertained by symptoms, sleeping, really poor nutrition, grossly overweight, hardly doing any physical activity. He'd only come out of his room for food and toileting. So this is where I really understood the chronic side of extreme human experience, which is, that's a very heavy life to be living, very hard life to be living. And my experience with him was, 2 to 4 times a week, we would walk and talk. I'd take him to Fitzroy River, Narrawong, just, all the beaches that he used to surf. And, it was a good 6-9 months before he even spoke to me, but just being present, just moving, and holding space for this young man was just such a learning for me, that translated so well into later on, the Olympic and Paralympic campaigns I've done that go for 4, 6, 8 years, to just be having that patience, to just be nurturing the strengths and the movements that you see in the ideal direction, and, having that real kindness again around the areas that the person's still struggling with. Truth, of course, but being kind with the truth through that. And after 3 years, this young gentleman moved into his own independent living. I'll never forget the first meal he cooked for me when I went around there one day. He reconnected with friends. He enrolled in a TAFE course, and he started surfing again. And it's still, I feel quite touched now recalling the experience. It's still, as a psychologist and as a human being, just to see someone move that far, it's actually quite interesting when I relate it to my work in high performance, where, I've worked with teams that won a silver medal at one games, and the next games they won a gold. And I know that there's a lot that goes into that from the outside. Looking in, silver to gold doesn't seem like too much of a movement, but to go from, basically a vegetative state to back to living your life was just, an incredible experience for me to have as a professional. actually, and at the time, when I very first arrived at Portland, I was having my own pretty heavy experience. I'd had a physical injury and I hadn't actually surfed for almost a year. And traditional pathways like, medical and physio and things like that, it was getting me to a point, but it wasn't a complete healing. And so in Portland, this is really where I started to seek alternative ways to heal myself, and I discovered yoga, and I discovered really self-study, the process of self-study, and it was really my awakening as a person, and it was an incredible enrichment to my psychological practice as well. So I practiced yoga and meditation daily for the whole 3 years I was there. My yoga teacher was also a climber, and he would drag me along as his belay buddy as he went up incredible pitches in the Grampians and Arapalis, and I'd second and bring all the gear up and the rope, and off we go. And we call that climasana. So an asana in yoga is the physical posture, and the movement of the asana begins with the heart and grows out through the body. And so we would apply the same approach to our movement up these pitches in the Grampians and Arapalis. We do climasana. And, taking responsibility for self, taking responsibility for co-creating and manifesting our own reality, that was the pathway for very rapid healing. In the injury that I had, I was back surfing within a month, and then surfing as much as I wanted within 3 months, and rock climbing and everything. I've never looked back. That injury's never returned too. So it was an amazing experience to see how, when I became attuned with my psyche, the healing in my body just unfolded, because the body's brilliant. It knows how to heal anyway. It's often the mind that's getting in its way, and that was my experience at that time. So that was really quite profound as well. And so mindfully evolving self, our true nature and our inner potential, a lot of that was also for me happening in surfing. I was very interested in my connections. While I was at Portland, I did lots of consulting work with the local Indigenous people, Windamara and Goodnichamara, around Portland, Hayward area, and really understood from the elders there the value of connectedness, connecting to country, culture and community. And these connections really ran deep for me in surfing, but they weren't something that I really explored. So going a little deeper with my surfing, surfing's a little more than just riding a wave. Football's a little more than just kicking a goal. And umpiring's a little more than just making a decision. So there's a wonderful opportunity to really go deeper with self when you're conscious about your activities of passion. And for me, that was surfing. This little poem, actually, it's a sentiment that arose out of a meditation that I did a couple of years ago when I was doing a fundraiser for Beyond Blue. I called 100 Dawns. I go to the beach and meditate for 100 dawns in a row. I'll just share it with you. Connection, momentum, a joyful ride in flow, intention, reflection, a deeper self to know. And for me, the deeper self to know at the time in Portland was to really face some fears that were arising. And for me, those fears were all about that big dream to surf Waimea Bay. I'd been surfing for over 15 or so years at this time now, or over a decade at this time. And I'd had a few pretty big sessions at Bells and Winky and places like that around Torquay, and a few places around Port Campbell and others are down the coast. But, my heart was really set on having a go at Waimea, and there's some big waves and very uncrowded waves, and perhaps some big fish or animals in the water around Portland, and not many people around. So I had my own fears to face, but I really wanted this, and I feel that's another element of evolving potential and achieving high performance is when you do that through an activity of passion, you're really prepared to go through both the outer obstacles and the inner adversities or inner obstacles. And so what I did, I was working day in, day out with people experiencing fear, whether it was panic disorder, anxiety disorder, other fears. So I became my first client in performance psychology. I started practicing what I was, the understandings and skills I was sharing with people day in, day out at Portland to manage their fears in their setting to my fears in my setting to surf the bigger waves around Portland and Port Campbell. And it just worked really, really well. And this path of experiential learning, which I feel kind of evolved serendipitously once I, rolled out the yoga mat in that first class, experiential learning, moving through a process mindfully, heartfully, and actually feeling your way through it. So, I might not be the gun rock climber that's taking life-threatening risks, or I might not be, the Formula One race driver that's taking life-threatening risks, but I do know what it's like to face my mortality in the ocean. So having that understanding of the psyche in those experiences, from an experiential perspective, I've found just profoundly beneficial in my practice as a psychologist. What it also did was begin to manifest surf psychology. I combine my passions for surfing and psychology, and that started, in terms of sharing that with the world, that started with a run of articles in Track's Surfing magazine in Australia. My first article is up there now, how to manage your fear, why big wave surfing is all mind games. I don't think I came up with that title. The editors might have had a little bit of liberty there, but it was an article that was all about what I was experiencing myself in the big waves and what I was doing, how I actually managed my fear. And it led to another few articles, mind surfing, how to use mental imagery to improve your surfing, the tube ride, the peak performance flow in surfing, and I looked at the cultural elements, the localism, and the harsh and also the helpful elements of localism. And that just unfolded or opened the door to working on the then ASP World Tour, the Association of Surfing Professionals World Tour, which I did for a bit over 3 years. That's now the World Surf League. And I did a number of research projects with actually one of my early lecturers, Peter Kramer, from Deakin, who was my mentor and co-researcher through my time on the surf tour. PK and I did, the 3 projects, one on peak performance, what's the ideal preparation and mindset for peak performance to win heats, and, what's actually happening on tour in terms of the stress. We looked at surf tour stress, and interestingly, the most challenging stressor for the surfers was mental demands, such as recovering from a loss, managing long distance relationships, what's going to happen with their sponsor negotiations, things like that. And then, of course, we looked at the psychology of big wave riding. And my first year on the tour, 2000, I went to Hawaii early because it was, along this path, I was feeling very ready to have my go at Waimea Bay, and I was very fortunate that when I got to Waimea, or I got to Hawaii that first season, it was a real bumper season. There was lots of, medium to solid Waimea days, and then eventually the really big Waimea day came. And it really felt like I had harmony of heart and mind on that day. That's actually the essence of the Aloha spirit, is that, when mind and heart are in harmony, when this beautiful tool that we've crafted, the mind, to manifest the love, the truth, the passion in our heart, surf Waimea, my Mount Everest, when that's attuned, it actually felt really dreamy surfing that day. And there was a little trepidation on the beach, but once I got in the water, it's still one of the most blissful days I've had in some of the largest surf I've been in. So I guess my simple advice there is, find your fear, respond with love, and that's a path to transcend. That really opened the door to my, I guess the last decade or so of what I've been doing in performance psychology. I launched The Surfer's Mind in 2004, my book. That's a complete practical guide to surf psychology. And I thought I'd go back on tour, but it felt like it was time for me to evolve as a performance psychologist. I just really worked with surfing. It's an individual sport. There wasn't Olympics involved back then. There's not even really coaches on the tour. So I was very fortunate to be appointed to a role at New South Wales Institute of Sport and moved to Sydney for 6 years. And from 2005 to 2011, that was just a wonderful time where I was fully open to obviously lots of other individual sports, but team sports, and an amazing collection of coaches, sports science, sports medicine professionals that, other colleagues that you could really bounce off and learn from and learn with. Continued to do some of the research, and I'd connected with Dr. Sue Jackson when I was doing my peak performance work on the surf tour, and we did a flow on snow project as well with the Winter Olympic athletes. So it was a wonderful time where all my understandings from Portland and the surf tour were coming together in a space and being really of value in these Commonwealth Game, Olympic, Paralympic, Summer and Winter Olympic campaigns, and with all these athletes. And just like the people down in Portland, it was so simple to have that understanding that you're a human first who happens to perform. So let's look after the human. A happy, healthy human is going to be a happy, high performer. And, that's always been a wonderful understanding as well as approach to my practice. Now, I've shared a range of peak moments in my personal and surfing and performance psychology career, so it's only fair now that I guess I share a peak moment in my AFL career and share a little bit more about my umpiring role now. This is the peak moment of my AFL career. I think I was about 11 years old in this photo. It's probably grade 6 footy team. I can't remember at all whether we did any good or not in the local the local league there. But I did enjoy footy. I did enjoy playing at that level, but it was something that never really took me. And I think around about the time the ocean really is what took me. But, I do understand performance psychology, and at the beginning of this year, the AFL umpires department were looking for a performance psychologist to assist with, clearly the mindset and the performance demands for the umpires, along with mental health and wellbeing and the culture, leadership, and other elements of the group. And so I was fortunate to be appointed to that role. I think they might have been quite interested to have someone come along with a fresh view that hadn't had much AFL experience. And as I shared earlier, that child's mind was really a path to my learning in Portland, and it's certainly been a path to my learning with the AFL umpires. So a little bit of background, there's 116 athletes or umpires that adjudicate or umpire the senior games at AFL. 34 field, 43 boundary, 27 goal, and they have 12 rookies this season. And you might be aware, AFL, there's 23 rounds, and at the end of that, the top 8 go into the finals in terms of the teams. Now for the umpires, the top 44 of those 116 go into the pool of umpires that will umpire the finals. But really it's about 36 because 8 of those are emergency in the first round and won't have the opportunity to run through. And then in the grand final, there's 12 umpires. So there's 9 umpires actively on the ground for every match. You've got your 3 field umpires, 4 boundary umpires and 2 goal umpires. But during the 23 rounds, there's 1 emergency for field and 1 for goal. And then in the finals, there's 1 emergency for all 3 disciplines. And then backing up the umpires, there's a wonderful collection of coaches. There's sports science, sports medicine professionals. They have their match day coaches as well. And there's a fair bit of technology going into assisting their adjudication of matches too. This year, AFL just launched the ARC, the AFL Review Centre. So what are some of the similarities between big wave riders and AFL umpires? Well, like I was sharing before, our mind is like our portal to the world around and world within, and a lot of my portal has been, some of the filters or the observations come from surfing understandings. And for me, the lineup, like that big lineup there of Bells Beach, is very similar to the MCG. It's a massive space that's alive, and the ocean is a place where to be successful and to be safe and to really explore all its opportunities and to explore your full potential, it's really about developing a very deep and intimate relationship with this living energy, and understanding all the subtleties and all the nuances. On a big day in particular, what's the safe entry, what's the safe exit, what are the waves that are not ideal to go for because they're just not makeable, or if the risk reward might be not in balance. What are some of the real subtleties? What's the actual surface of the water telling you in terms of, is there a set approaching? Am I in a good position? Am I in a not a good position? And what are some of the lineups along the cliff or the beach that I need to be attuned to so that I can maintain ideal positioning? And I found that, the lineup in surfing is very much the same as the field in football, because there's so much information and so much detail that the umpires need to be attuned to, again, to be safe and successful and optimise their performance in their role. And preparation's huge for this. Total commitment in preparation is the basis for total commitment in the moment. And there's many more hours that goes into being readying oneself to ride a big wave than the few seconds it takes to ride one usually. And, after spending the year with the AFL umpires, there's so many more hours happening in the training and the preparation than the 2 or so hours that happen on match day. Some of the elements of preparation include the management side. Obviously a lot of umpiring is about decision making and adjudicating actual play, but there's also management. So something I've been really impressed by is that the umpires know all the players by first name, and they have a sense of when the matchups known, what matchups might present some management challenges, if you like, in the play or behind the play. So there's some real subtleties going on there that are very similar to the subtleties in the ocean when you're wanting to be safe and successful in big waves. There's a lot of teamwork that goes on. This year there was 9 new rules brought into the game, and one of those was the 666, which is the setup for the centre bounce each time. And all 3 disciplines are involved in assisting that. So, the goal umpires ensuring that there's a pair in the square, and the boundary and the other field umpires, or all the field umpires, are ensuring that, you've got your 666 set up. So the teamwork is very important, both among the 3 disciplines as well as within the 3 disciplines. Quite classically, the field umpires are running a little bit of a triangular system out there on the field, where you've got one umpire in the end zone that's really, in command of the observation and response and really running with the play, and you've got the other 2 in direct support, being another pair of eyes to pick up both a new angle on the play, and sometimes they can actually make a decision from the support role, but also have a pair of eyes on some of the management challenges that might be going on. So it's a little bit like, when you're surfing really big waves, sure, you want to go out there, you want to catch the ride of your life, but a very important element of it is that you're keeping an eye out for your buddies, because things can go wrong very quickly. And I was actually involved in a rescue of a professional big wave rider a couple of years ago down the coast in Victoria, which, if there weren't eyes on that guy, he certainly would not have made it. A lot of emotions go through you as well when you're out surfing big waves, and ideally the ones you want, confidence, things like that. Sometimes there's a few emotions that can get a little high and activated that might not be ideal for the moment, and that's been a really important observation and an impressive element of the umpiring too. You can imagine the intensity of emotion amongst the players, particularly in the final series, but pretty much every game. They're out there to win every game. And when an umpire has to adjudicate perhaps or manage some player behaviour that's not within the rules, the emotional intelligence that I've observed amongst AFL umpires is very impressive, because they're staying mentally composed, they're using first names, their language is polite, to maintain that when the humans around you are in a very intense emotional space. We're all aware of how contagious emotions can be. It's a really impressive part of their role that is right in there with the big wave riding experience. So when you've prepared yourself to maintain composure, when your observations are, wow, this is the wave and this is the life or death, but I'm going, it's very, very impressive, and it's a very similar mental state. Now, something that might be pretty obvious is that if you're not in the right position, you can't even catch a wave, and that is very true in big waves. Big waves move a lot quicker than small waves. There's a lot more water moving, and you're really just this little cork in the ocean. So having the ideal positioning to actually catch a wave and have an entry into a big wave. Some waves, they're catchable, but only if you're in a certain position, because one part of the lip, like this picture here, is absolutely throwing out into space, and you don't want to be trying to take off there. But then if you're a little too wide, you won't catch the thing at all. So it's very subtle to be in the ideal position. And for the umpiring, it's the same, to be able to make an accurate decision, but also to be able to make a non-decision that's accurate too. In other words, let the play go. In other words, let the wave go. You really need to be in the ideal position, and that's across all 3 disciplines, whether you're adjudicating the run of the play on the field, whether you're running the boundary, and we all know the AFL ball's an odd shape, so it has an odd bounce, and there can be a few players on that line, and the body can be out, but the ball can be in, so there's positioning for the boundary umpire is really important, and of course all the scoring opportunities. Having ideal positioning for the goal umpires is paramount. With good positioning, that's really going to facilitate good decision making, to go or not to go. And as I just shared, in big wave riding, you actually end up letting a lot more waves go than the ones you catch, because you're really trying to target being in the right position so that you're optimising the ability to be safe and successful, to have the ride of your life. And so it's the same with the umpiring. if you call what you see, and it's such a great highlight of the support roles as well, because you cannot see every angle every time. And another interesting thing, which is probably one of those elements that's a little different with the umpiring, particularly field and boundary, a bit different to big wave riding, is their motors running at 80-90% physically anyway, with all the running they're doing. A field umpire will average 14-15 kilometres a match. A boundary umpire can average 16 to 18 kilometres a match, and a lot of that's sprint work too. So sometimes it's backwards sprint work and sideways sprint work and all sorts of agility work, and then in between you've got these skills that you're doing. So making decisions is highly intuitive, and it's an interesting thing where you're wanting the mind to be so calm and clear that what you're seeing almost looks like it's slowed down so you can see it really well. And that's where the intuition is such a powerful part of our mental game. For me, I understand that to be the highest quality element of our mental game, and it's where we can just observe and respond. And we're responding to two things. Obviously, what we observe in front of us, the movement of the play or the movement of the wave, but we're also observing and responding to what's arising within us, that intuition, that sense of yes or no, go or don't go. And to do that, composure's a really, really important part. The big wave riding project I did with the surfers in Hawaii that first season identified a mindset, I guess, the ideal mindset for riding big waves. I called it the 3 C's for calm, confident and committed. And particularly with this does apply to all the umpires, but particularly with the goal umpires, when a big wave's coming in, the composure to stay in position, to stay calm when this huge mountain of the ocean is growing over you. And because if you paddle out, firstly you're going a different direction to the wave, you've got to spin around late, and that can make it a little more critical or not possible. So you really must sit in the spot and allow this huge wave to just grow up and grow around you, and then as you paddle for it, it lifts you up backwards. And it's not really until you reach that that point of where gravity takes over that you really start to drive into the wave, take that drop, head down the face and start to plant your rail and see if you can make this wave. The goal umpires, classically the same. A set shot at goal or some of the fast movements at goal, the ball's often high, so they've got to be looking up, but at the same time, they've got to be knowing their position on the line and their position to see the scoring opportunity. And then all these players are growing around them like a big wave. And, in my observation, most of the AFL players, particularly the full forwards, full backs, are a lot bigger than the goal umpires. So there's this really intense physical threat to their safety, but at the same time, they've got, like big wave riding, but at the same time, they've got a job to do, and they've got, a commitment, and to stay calm and committed in that moment, have that composure, is really impressive. The other important element about the composure is the energy management. For me, high performance is all about managing energy. And if my mind is not composed, in other words, if it's agitated, anxious, frustrated, that's using a lot of energy. And I understand there's only one fuel tank for mind and body. So if your body's got to do a lot of work, such as the field and boundary umpires, you want the mind to be in a really fresh, composed, efficient space. Firstly, so that you've got good energy for the whole 4 quarters all the way to the final siren. But secondly, of course, because the role they're playing mentally is just so intense and so challenging as well. So the composure is a way to maintain great efficiency of use of your energy for mind and body, and so being able to sustain high quality performance for the whole duration, the whole 4 quarters. And not just the whole 4 quarters, in surfing, as in life and in umpiring, we also have our wipeouts. So obviously the intention is to prepare and execute to our full potential to achieve personal best every time. But the reality is we're not perfect, and the reality is that, when we step out of our comfort zone, when we step into the unknown, sometimes things don't actually go as planned. Sometimes it can be when we are in our comfort zone, we might drop our guard. But what I understand about surfing is that there's really 2 rides. There's one above the water and there's one under the water. And to be a complete surfer, and certainly to ride big waves, you really need to master both. You need to master how to ride the wave to catch the wave, how to ride the wave successfully, the equipment, all the factors that go into it, the safety team, everything above the water. And then under the water, you need to know how to manage the wipeout, the adversities in your performance, the adversities in life. And obviously for big wave riding, your physical preparation is going to be things like improving your breath hold, making sure that you've got really good ocean swimming skills, because sometimes you don't have a board or other way to get in when you pop up from a wipeout. And you also have to be smart about, again, your energy management. So there's lots of big waves that are very far offshore. So you want to surf until you've got jelly arms when you're in small fun waves. But when you're in big waves, you always want to know that you've got enough in the tank to get back to the beach if things go wrong. And in umpiring, it's almost like the field is more of a sanctuary sometimes than what can happen off field, because of course you've got the players on field, I guess, can every now and then give a bit of a spray, or at least give their view on whether that was a correct or incorrect decision. And the coaches, the clubs, there's the media, and as some of those headlines show, it can be a bit of a challenging thing to be doing your job in front of 100,000 people. Half of them are for every decision you make, half of them are against every decision you make. If you're a goal umpire, you've got a huge cheer squad that for one quarter's, well, depending on what the score is, sometimes for you, sometimes against you, just a couple of metres behind. So there's a lot of energy around you that is potentially a mental wipeout, because if we get caught up in that negative energy, that can really cause anxiety and doubt. If we start doubting ourselves, we start hesitating, and that's where in big waves you're really going to go down, and in AFL umpiring errors are going to happen, and so we actually create more of what we're fearing most. And sometimes it's about the decisions. Sometimes you can have an absolute legend of the game make comments around the actual philosophy of the umpire and how they're going, and so some of the commentary that happens around the umpires, it can come from all angles, and sometimes it can come out of nowhere in terms of the umpire, the coach, match day coach, and the coaches feeling that was a fantastic performance. But there's lots of people watching, so there's going to be different views at different times. So learning how to manage the adversities is just as important, for mastery in surfing as it is mastery in AFL umpiring. When we can ride the wave above the water and we can ride the wave under the water, we're going to be more confident and more easily composed in heavy situations. So just to give a bit of a brief summary, I feel like one of the elements that's important to capture in this summary is just the value of culture. When I went to Hawaii and I learned about the aloha spirit and the depth of that and the value of that, and how having mind and heart in harmony is such a beautiful way to not only optimize performance but to enrich experience and what we share with people. How we actually approach that is going to have a big impact. And this quote by Ross Williams is from my book, The Surfer's Mind, and he was sharing, growing up in Hawaii had such a positive impact on my path to becoming comfortable in big surf. I was stoked on big waves, and by no means was I pushed into it. I had a group of friends that showed me how fun and exciting surfing in big waves was. This made me go for it with the feeling of exploration. I always approach big surf with a smile. It is pleasure. And, when you've got people around you that are smiling, that was one of the things that happened to me at Waimea Bay. When I paddled out on that really big day, I saw two Hawaiians catch a huge one, and the one on the inside went down, and the one on the outside made the wave, but he turned around after he made the wave to look for his buddy, and his buddy just had the heaviest wipeout I had ever seen from the water at that point in my life. And this Hawaiian guy just popped up with the biggest smile on his face, and they were laughing and joking, and it was just such a happy feeling, and it was what actually drew me straight to the takeoff zone. I thought I'd just paddle out and watch, and if it looks too heavy, I'll paddle in. But to see how happy and how calm and relaxed they were in the ocean. The ocean is part of their ohana, their family. It's kind of like the mother of the ohana in Hawaiian culture. So to be held by your mother is, it's a joyful experience. And the culture in the AFL umpiring department is something that's been very impressive to see. There's not many accolades out there for AFL umpiring, and as I was just sharing with the Wipeouts, sometimes they can be very heavily grilled, whether it's by players, by coaches, by teams, by the media, and by fans. So to have a close group around you that have that depth of understanding of what it is you actually do, how incredibly hard it is, how incredibly impressive it is, and that actually, do the runs, do the skill drills, do the psych sessions, do all the preparation and work with you. And if you can do that with the joy, if you can do that with the pleasure, then the pressure is something that you can really keep at bay, and in fact it becomes pleasure because you've let go of that perspective or that possibility mentally. So just to briefly summarise, gone through in terms of high performance and enrichment, which I feel is just such an important part of performance as well as daily life. The value of our passions, the value of our gurus, and of course our professional study along with self-study. And, as I shared, there's a lot more to surfing than riding a wave. The opportunities for self-study and our activities of passion are just abundant, and they're so fruitful when we're conscious about what we're doing and we're honest with self and the process of how we're evolving, both, our successes and our non-successes. So that's mastering that right above and below, and, being connected to a culture and being involved in teamwork. Everything's a co-creation. From the moment we arrive, we take a breath, and that's a co-creation with nature, and that gives us life. And in high performance, we have a team. And even if it's an individual sport like surfing, or even if it's just one goal umpire at one end of the ground that's got to make this decision, the other goal umpire can't help from that far away, there's still, you feel confident, you feel assured, you can maintain composure because you've got that really sound group, that connection to culture and community around you. And I think what's shared amongst that is the higher purpose. The higher purpose in big wave riding really is that we all get home safely, so we can have a good chat about how big those waves were, how heavy the wipeouts were, and we can share that with our loved ones. And the higher purpose in AFL umpiring is really to deliver the quality and integrity of umpiring to the highest level for the game. And that's what I'm most impressed by with the AFL umpiring department, is their connection, their consciousness and their efforts to maintain the quality and integrity of their performance for the higher purpose. So thanks everyone. I really appreciate everyone that's tuned in today for the webinar, and I also like to say a few of my own thank yous. There's been quite a few photos in this slideshow. I've actually taken most of them, but obviously, me wiping out or riding waves has been taken by other people, Heidi Atkins and Mick Sowry and Ed Sloan, some great photographers around Torquay. And, thanks very much to the AFL for supplying the images of the umpires. And again, thanks very much to Deakin alumni for creating the space to share with everyone today. Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much, Richy, for such an insightful presentation. It's been fantastic to hear from you. And now's the time for our audience members to send any questions they have, and we'll get to as many as we can. So just write them into the question box on your screen and hit submit, and we'll get to them soon. Thanks again, Richy.
Thank you.
While we wait for those questions to come in, might start off, as you suggest, with maybe a question about some of your recommendations or the ways for us to be more maybe present in the day-to-day life and to refocus that in-tuneness with reality that you were talking about.
Yeah. The ideal place to start is to utilise the tools and the gifts we have every moment. So 3 things that are available to us in every moment is our breath, is our body, and is our mind. And when we attune to our breath, that brings the focus back into the present moment because we're breathing in the present moment. The other beauty of that, particularly when it's intentional breathing to either activate oneself to do something very powerful or to really calm and compose oneself, there's a real clarity of mind that comes in. So it assists us, and there's, on a nervous system level, we start to shift and play around with the nervous system too. So from the inside out, we're actually shifting ourselves. The body is just a profound guru for the mind, and talking about fear before, fear can be really uncomfortable, but so can pain. So if you're running and you twist your ankle, if there was no pain signal at all, then you would keep running and your ankle injury would become worse and worse and worse, and therefore the recovery process would be longer and longer and more difficult. We have the pain, and pain is that message to say, hey, something needs a look at here. So we stop, we seek deeper understanding, we feel out the ankle, and when we have that understanding, we make a more informed choice about what to do. Oh, I think I'll let go of the run, or, oh, that's okay, I've been fortunate, it's just a little bit of a strain, I'm going to be fine. So with fear, that's the same thing too. When that arises, it can be quite uncomfortable, but when we take a breath, when we compose the body, adjust the posture, even soften the face, and just observe, oh, what is the fear? How does it feel? Where's it come from? And what might be my ideal response? Then I'm able to move from that moment to a better feeling next moment and process. The mind side, that's something that we can play around with in terms of a perspective or approach we take into an experience, such as I'd love to have fun out here in this surf, or my intention is to be really quite activated and active in this surf or this umpiring, or like I was sharing with, bigger picture with my relationship and guidance of Mana's training, is my intention and my approach is about kindness. And then how that unfolds is quite intuitive, because kindness is always the reference point in my mind with any behaviour that I see, both undesired and desired. So the mind can be that powerful tool. And then, of course, in the moment, particularly when we use body and breath to calm and clear the mind, we're better able to make choices of where we take our attention and our decision making.
Great, thanks, Richy. We've had a few more questions come in. Do keep the questions coming. So one of our attendees, Long, has asked, this is a Chinese student who's wanting to be an AFL umpire, just wondering if you've got any information on some of the pathways that people go through to become umpires.
Yes, it's quite interesting.
Very specific.
It's a little bit like, from my observation so far, it's a little bit like how I ended up surfing Waimea Bay. I started in a local shore break, and in other words, there's local clubs, regional clubs, and then there's the different leagues. So depending on what state you're in, VFL, WAFL, there's pathways within those leagues. And what I would encourage is going on to, I think it's the AFL website actually, and there is information on there. There's another website, probably the AFL website's the ideal one, and you could do a search, or it might even be pretty easy to find on the menus, umpiring. And in the region that you're in, there might be also a regional website with some contact numbers and some contact people that you can have a chat with and gain some direct light on the ideal pathway to become an AFL umpire.
Thanks, Richy, and good luck along with your quest. Thanks. Kelly asks, do you think you'll stay in sport over the next 20 years?
Well, I'll always be active because we're built to move, and I really enjoy it. But in terms of my actual practice of performance psychology, one of the reasons that I use the title performance psychology is because sport is only one domain of performance that I work in. And as shared in Sam's introduction, I've done a lot of work with artists, dancers, musicians, actors, actresses, and choreographers, a range of people in the artistic world, a range of people in our security, military services, emergency services, lots of people in healthcare, in education, from here at Deakin, doing some performance work with some of the students here, through to basic mindfulness and fun games with kids at the local primary school in Torquay, and then doing my mentoring program across there, but quite often in the professional and corporate sector. So I already work a lot in performance across a whole range of settings, and I'm sure sport will continue to be part of that because I really love and enjoy that. And the other settings are also quite enriching too, and I find when I spend time, say, in a healthcare or a corporate setting, there's some understandings that arise that invigorate my work in the sports setting, and then, as I've shared today, some of the insights from the sports setting can help invigorate my work and our experience in other settings and personal life.
Great. Got a couple of questions which tie into each other. One person's asked what advice you have to move on from errors, and another person has asked any advice for avoiding reliving mistakes that we make, so avoiding doing them again, but also moving on from them.
Well, the first part of the question, responding to errors, that's a really great question, because it's a reality of our human experience that every now and then we will make an error. That's really that humility part that I just touched on earlier, that, when we make an error, how we respond is really going to be the most important part, whether that's an error that we have to respond to later or it's an error right in the moment. Now, okay, I've paddled in the wrong position for this wave and I'm now launched in the air. So if it's in the moment, quite interestingly, and Kelly Slater talks about this in my book, The Surface Mind, that when we're very present in the moment, even if things go wrong, we stay quite composed, because we're just dealing with what's happening moment to moment, the free fall, the impact, the wipeout, and then we'll have time to review that as we're paddling back out. In other words, well, was I in the right position? Did I jump to my feet quick enough? Do I need to take a couple of extra paddle strokes? So whatever your performance experience is, there can be some tangible, practical skill changes or decision-making changes that you can do in the next moment if you need to deliver again. When it's, there's a bit more time around an error, we've made a decision and we can kind of see it unfolding, so it wasn't the greatest decision, or as the second part of the question touched on, that we seem to be repeating patterns of behaviour or decision-making or behaviour that don't serve us. That's where self-study is such a beautiful and profound pathway to understand, hang on, it's quite natural. Our body grows, adulthood, and then decays. So our body's in a state of change throughout its whole existence. Well, ideally, the mind and our belief systems are, like the bathymetry I touched on earlier. So we can actually form belief systems, at 10 years of age, so that we can survive and thrive. And if we stay stuck to those, a 10-year-old's view of the world trying to be applied when we're 20 or trying to be applied when we're 30 or 40 isn't really going to fit. So it wasn't a wrong thing or a bad thing that I formed this belief system at a 10-year-old. And in fact, when I talked about the wounding with the passing of my first puppy, it's actually a classic example where the grief experience of that took a long time to process, even though I'd had another dog and I'd grown up. And it wasn't until I got to Portland and really had that awakening of practicing yoga and getting into that self-study process that it's like, well, hang on, what I was thinking and how I protected myself with that isn't necessary anymore. And once you knock down the wall, like the Pink Floyd The Wall album, it all opens up again, what's available, the opportunities, and of course, what's the next path.
Right. And there was just a little follow-on from that question. One of the people who asked the questions was saying, having errors haunting you, how do we stop thinking like that? I know you've sort of touched on some of that, but did you want to touch on it a bit more?
Yeah. Another pathway which is really helpful is cultivating our gift of mindfulness. Now, there's lots of information out there about mindfulness and what it is. So like I said before, psychologists are like musicians. You tune into the understanding and the practice of mindfulness that resonates for you. The one that resonates for me is a really simple one. I understand that the mind works best when we keep things simple, and that is mindfulness begins with awareness of the world around and the world within. If we're not aware, we can't act for change. We just keep doing it literally without awareness. We're unconscious. So awareness is the starting point. But then, of course, if we're aware of everything in the world around as well as the world within, which is a lot of stimuli, a lot of information, that could become overwhelming. So the divine purpose of mindfulness, in my understanding, is actually about our divine nature, which is freedom. It's free will. It's free choice. So cultivating this gift of awareness, of being able to be aware objectively, observe reality as it is, without judgment, without labels, without opinions. And that reality includes the arisings from within, my identity, how I think and feel about self. We observe these thoughts because we can't actually control thoughts. If I ask you not to think of the colour purple, the colour purple is going to arise, and then maybe even a story about that's going to arise, if your old school uniform had purple or something like that. So it's more, things arise in the mind, just like waves rise in the ocean. Performance demands, decision-making demands arise for AFL umpires. We have the option, the choice, the free will to act or to let it go. And as I shared with Jimi Hendrix's lyric, the castle's made of sand. Whatever will arise will fall away. So I can observe these thoughts that are around that past mistake, that if I give them energy, they're going to grow. When I observe them and allow them to fall away, and eventually they will, well, then they're going to, lose their energy. And then you can also be quite intentional. I can choose to observe these thoughts with gratitude because I am seeking the lesson of these thoughts. I can choose to observe these thoughts with any other sentiment that I feel is going to assist me to move through from the discomfort of the thought to the comfort of seeing them fall away and having the opportunity to choose a better thought or a better approach to my experience. And then, as I shared before, making practical changes, actions. It's a quote that I love from the Dalai Lama. It's wonderful to do all this self-study and this inner work, but actions are what make a difference with you and the world. So we actually start to put into action the change that we have in our mind. And it's no different to having a dream and a vision we put into action so that we realise that when it's about inner changes of belief or moving through errors, it's the same process.
Right. We had one question from Matt who says, Richy, tell us about your breakfast/morning routine.
Well, Mana's changed that quite a bit because, I've been a morning person for a long time. Pretty much since I finished school, I moved to Torquay and lived, just a moment from the beach. I became a full-on pre-dawn morning person. It's been the same since. But I like to get up pre-first light. I love that softness of the light pre-sunrise in the beginning of the day. I'll often meditate, but as I was just alluding to before, Mana's changed that a bit because he likes to get active, and it's been quite a nice change to get up and actually start the day with some real activity, taking for a walk or a swim or something like that. And I actually find that very meditative as well. A little bit like my preface to what mindfulness is. Meditation is a whole lot of things too, and it can be done a whole lot of ways. And sometimes I'm meditating as I'm walking with Mana. Other times there might be some pumping surf. So after I've walked him, I'll go and have a surf. And I've really been enjoying growing my own fruit trees and veggie garden and eating from my garden. So most often I'll walk out and pick. At the moment the citrus is in, so I'll pick a grapefruit or a tangelo or something like that, and that'll start my brekkie. Then the day opens up.
Breakfast of Champions.
Yeah.
Great. We're getting close to the end of our question time, but there's a question from Ashley who asked, have you ever had experience working with Australian Defence Force frontline servicemen and women?
The main work I've actually done with military is a Wounded Warriors program that was set up between Australian Army and Australian Paralympic Committee. And a lot of that was looking at, how can we create a pathway between these servicemen and women who have had the misfortune of being injured severely in their service to becoming Paralympians. And because of the mindset and the conditioning that they've had with military service, it's really a powerful mindset they bring to the performance space. And then it's also such a wonderful experience for those humans to reinvigorate all that beauty of dreaming, of striving, of achieving that can happen in sport.
Right. Well, thanks so much for all your time, Richy, and for your insights. And sorry to anyone whose questions we didn't get to. We might ask them to Richy afterwards and send you an email with the response. But thanks very much. It's been great to have you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Sam.
Just a few quick messages from Alumni Relations World here. So please do follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and LinkedIn, and we have some great offers available through those. So please do jump on and give us a follow. There are some excellent competitions at the moment and moving onwards. So make sure you read your Deakin Times and follow us on social media. You'll hear all about that. One of which we have running at the moment involves staying connected with us, so updating your details through the alumni portal will put you automatically in the running for one of our great competitions at the moment. So please do that, and you can find more information online. Thanks so much for joining us. You can provide feedback to the email address on the screen there, deaconalumni@deakin.edu.au. And as I mentioned, there'll be a recording available in around 3 weeks of today's webinar on our YouTube channel and also on the alumni website. Thanks again and have a great day.